Welcome to 2.2 Cell Size. Note disclaimer.
I'm a cell, which makes up a tissue.
I'm a tissue, which makes up an organ.
I'm an organ, which makes up an organ system.
Let's talk about how we come about to understand what cell size is and why it's so important. Let's first talk about section 2.1 before we dive into 2.2. And I want you to first think about the cell and all those organelles that are inside the cell, including the Golgi apparatus or the endoplasmic reticulum. These are all organelles, and they make up the cells, which make up tissues. For example, I want you to think of muscle cells, which make up muscle tissues, which eventually make up an organ known as the heart. And that heart makes up what we call the circulatory system or the organ system. And that eventually makes up us, human beings. And the purpose of understanding this is having you realize that us as human beings are dependent on cells to be very efficient. So cells stay very compact. And the reason why they do this is because they need to ensure that nutrients are coming in and waste is coming out while minimizing the volume of the actual cell. And the reason why is that when we increase the volume, so you want to think of the 3D space inside that cell, it requires a greater intake of nutrients. Remember, there are all these organelles within a cell. You have the Golgi apparatus, you have the endoplasmic reticulum. These are all organelles that require energy. And if we have too many of them or too much, that means that we have to have a greater intake of nutrients to ensure that the cell is running the way it needs to run. So to help compensate, we have a large surface area. So a surface area is this space on the outside here, and that large surface area is important because it helps facilitate improved nutrient absorption. So if you remember, in a cell, they have on the outside what's called a plasma membrane. And a plasma membrane, there is a whole section dedicated just for plasma membrane because it runs so efficiently. And the reason why it runs so efficiently is because it has to make sure those nutrients come in and the waste comes out in the best way possible. And you'll see that in a later section, but for now, you just want to know that the goal is to take advantage of a large surface area while also ensuring that we're limiting the total volume. Let's talk about the cell size as it relates to surface area and volume. When I'm talking about surface area, I'm going to abbreviate it sometimes as SA. And when I talk about volume, I'm going to use V as another way to represent volume. So when we talk about surface area versus volume, we're usually talking about it in terms of a ratio. So you can think of it as SA over V. So when we're talking about surface area over volume, I want you to think about it in terms of a fraction. So if we say that the surface area increases, then the overall ratio increases. And vice versa, if we have the overall ratio decreasing, that can be also dictated by the surface area also going down as well. It is a direct relationship. So for example, if we have 3 over 1 versus 4 over 1, the ratio itself increases when that top number changes. Just a little math review there. Now, let's take a look at surface area over volume again, and let's now change the volume. So let's say that we take the volume down. Well, that means that the overall ratio is going to increase. And vice versa, if the volume then increases, then the overall ratio decreases. To give an example, let's say that we have 1 over 3 versus 1 over 4. 1 over 3 means it's going to be 0.33. 1 over 4, you want to think of a quarter. 0.25. So essentially, when we made the number go up, the overall value went down. So it's inversely related. So now that we know that, let's tie this into biology. So we have a cell, and if we have a cell, and let's say that we snipped that cell in half. So if we have a cell and we go ahead and snip it in half, we can go ahead and say that we have two halves. Now, surface area is the idea of taking a look at just the outside. So those are usually the plasma or the plasma membrane specifically, that outer covering. So when we're talking about surface area, if we were to flatten the structure, we would go ahead and say that it's just the outside of that cell. So that is usually like thinking about if you had some sort of wrapper. Think of if you have a candy wrapper, it's just going to cover on the outside. And if we were to flatten it, that would be our surface area. Now, volume is a little bit different. It's the stuff inside. So let's say that we took our two halves and we were to fill it with water. If that's the case, then we would go ahead and say that the volume is the space that's inside. So the 3D structure. Volume in terms of a cube is usually length times width times height. And the portion of this is to understand that it's 3D. So it's all the stuff that's inside the cell. And based on section 2.1, you'll note that that's the cytoplasm and the organelles that are filled inside the cell itself. And so that's going to dictate our volume. Now, the point is if we have a high surface area to volume, that means that we have faster material exchange. If we have a low surface area to volume, we have a slower material exchange. So let's talk about this. So if we have a cell itself and we have a high surface area, but it's squished in a little bit more, but we have the same volume. There's less stuff inside, which means that there's going to be less of a need for nutrients and a less of a need for waste, which means that there is going to be less necessity for the inside of the cell to remove things inside or to bring things in. So the purpose of surface area versus volume is to show the relationship between what comes in and what comes out, and understanding that that high surface area provides an opportunity for this material exchange. And by that, we're talking about the relationship between waste and food intake or nutrients that come inside. So some things to note when we're talking about our cell. The surface area increase to volume has been dictated by several adaptations. So the first one is intestinal cells. So intestinal cells, I should say, intestinal cells. And mostly what you see on the top here is called microvilli. And so microvilli, as you can see here, it's not fully caved in. It's just sort of like little string-like structures. And an example of this is microvilli that helps increase that surface area. Another one is alveoli. You want to think of your lungs. The alveoli has thin walls and higher surface area, mostly for gas exchange in your lungs. You don't need to know that part, but you just need to know that there are thin walls inside but large surface area to allow for that exchange. It needs to go ahead and release CO2 and bring in oxygen. Remember, you're going to learn in a later unit that there is respiration, which involves the exchange between oxygen and CO2. And once again, that is necessary to have a large surface area because you're exchanging oxygen with CO2. Other extensions of adaptations include root hairs, which increase absorption, and flatworms, which have a flat shape. So these are just some examples, just to note that when we're talking about cellular activity in general, we're talking about this idea of ATP synthesis. I want you to take a look at this mitochondria, which is an organelle inside the cell. And if you remember, the organelle mitochondria creates ATP, which once again, you're going to talk about in later units. The process of ATP synthesis and transport involves a lot of things coming in and out of the mitochondria itself. And because of this, what happens is they have these little bends that are inside, and that is because it needs to have surface area increase for optimal membrane performance. The cell size, which is smaller cells that have a higher surface area to volume, facilitate better material exchange. As we said before, remember, the smaller the cell, that means the smaller stuff inside, which means that there's lower need for exchange of those nutrients versus the waste that is there. So as cells get bigger, their surface area to volume tends to decrease because you have more stuff on the inside of the cell, more organelles. And this can impact functions like the ATP synthesis and the heat exchange. Once again, while the mitochondria is its own entity, it is dependent on the organelles that it has a relationship with, like the Golgi apparatus and the endoplasmic reticulum. So because of this, it dictates based on this idea that a smaller surface area is better. Now let's talk about the volume itself. When you are given a AP biology question, I want you to note that there is a formula sheet that you are given as this is recorded. Please note that you will get the formula sheet provided on the test that will have these surface area and volume formulas. The point is just basically to say that volume grows faster than surface area as the size increases. So as we get bigger, we have more volume. And cells divide more efficiently when the surface area restricts the flow of vital nutrients because dividing of cells, which is the process you're also going to talk about, such as mitosis, which is splitting of cells, requires some energy to progress. And to do that, they need a high surface area and lower volume to ensure that one cell can divide into two. If we had a bigger cell, that would take more energy to go ahead and divide, which is interesting because if we talk about the earlier portion that we talked about, remember that cells make up tissues, which make up organs, which make up organ systems. So making sure that we have the high surface area really increases our functionality of not just the cell itself, but organ systems as well. Think about when we breathe in. If we had really big cells, it'd be harder for us to breathe in. Let's talk about the relationship between surface area and volume when it comes to organisms. Remember, we talked about how cells eventually lead to organisms. So organism size can affect the heat loss and metabolism based on their size. So if we talk about small animals like a mouse, the thing is they have a high surface area to the lower volume, which means there's a larger outside versus inside, which means that it loses a lot of heat pretty rapidly. And this leads to a higher metabolism, which is very efficient. Whereas large animals like this elephant here, if you think about it, they walk very slowly as compared to a mouse. And that's because they have a low surface area to a higher inside or higher volume. And that's because it loses heat more slowly, which means that it has a lower metabolism, so it's not as efficient. So if a mouse and an elephant were going head to head, the mouse would be more efficient at completing a process. Let's try to tackle this situation together. I call it a situation. I don't call it a multiple choice question, and I don't call it a free response question because this is just an open-ended table. And the reason why I want to show you this table is because you can get a lab related question in both formats, multiple choice or free response, or you can get some sort of scenario based question where they tell you something, more than likely a cell, or something within an organism where the surface area either increases or decreases, or the volume increases or decreases. And you're expected to try to figure out not only the ratio changes, but what that actually means for the individual item, such as the cylinder. So in this case, I want you to take a moment and try to figure out the surface area to volume ratio. All you have to do is take the surface area divided by the volume, making sure that you have the division sign and making sure to reduce it. Now, if you need a calculator, go ahead and get it now. And then once you're done reviewing, please make sure to come back to figure out the answer. Okay, so now that we have our answer, the answer is going to be 4 to 1, 3 to 1, and 3 to 1. And you can see the division symbol here. I don't think it's necessary to go into more details. You're just taking the numerator and dividing it by the denominator and then simplifying it to the nearest whole number, essentially, to get your ratio. Now, you might be thinking, what is the purpose of doing this? Well, there are questions, I should say, where you can be asked, what is the best case scenario? And in that case, you would say this one right here, because the value of the surface area is highest for all three case scenarios. And based on the information that you know that this is going to be increased in efficiency, which means that it's going to be similar to something like the mouse versus the elephant, where it's going to be the most efficient. And this is because you want the smallest space inside so you can have nutrients and waste based on the organelles within a cell to be smallest to ensure that it's an exchange that can be conducive for the cell's overall benefit. So that's just a scenario-based item that you can receive. Now let's try to tackle a multiple choice question. Okay, so here we have a multiple choice question. Make sure to pause this video and unpause once completed and figuring out your answer. Okay, now that you have your answer, let's see if you got the right choice. The best case answer is answer choice B. Let's talk about this. So it says, which is a primary reason for the cell constraints on the specific cell type? So it talks about specific cell types. It says larger cells evolving from smaller cells. We know we don't want larger cells. We talked about the whole scenario with the elephant versus the mouse. You want smaller cells. So that is not going to be the correct answer. And you go to answer choice C, it talks about eukaryotes evolving subsequent to prokaryotes. That doesn't really have anything to do with cell size, although we do know on average that eukaryotes tend to be more evolved, but that doesn't really solve as the best answer. And D says noting that a longer cell generally has higher cell volume, and that isn't the best case scenario. Answer choice B basically says ensuring an adequate surface area for the cell's function. Perfect. The reason why we can say this is whenever we're talking about size constraints, we want a great surface area, ensuring that you have a greater opportunity for exchange of nutrients and waste with efficiency. And we don't want larger cell size because that could be inefficient, because that means that the volume is greater and the surface area is smaller, and we don't like that scenario. So answer choice B, compared to all the answer choices, is your best choice yet.
Appreciate you riding along for our cosmic journey. If today's mission brought you the knowledge that slaps, make sure to hit that like button to boost that signal. Subscribe if you're locked in for our next launch. And don't miss the link tree. It's got all the goods for AP Bio, PSAT Math, and FSAT Math. Before I sign out, make sure you're all in one orbit and diving in. Killing out. Till next time.